My online boyfriend is the most dangerous man in the city. A dramatic narrative narrated in the first person by Cleo Fontaine. Part 1: The Game. It started as the most improbable things often do with a game. I am not the kind of person who plays video games. This is not a statement of superiority. It is simply a fact about who I was before all of this, a 26-year-old financial analyst living alone in a one-bedroom apartment in the 4th arrondissement of Paris, who spent her weekdays immersed in spreadsheets and her weekends in a pleasant and organized rhythm of the Marche d'Aligre on Saturday mornings, the occasional gallery on Sunday afternoons, and the specific and companionable solitude of a person who is not unhappy, but is perhaps a little too organized. My friend Mathilde is responsible for the game. She insisted on the occasion of my birthday in March that I needed what she called a controlled stimulus, by which she meant something that would require me to pay attention to something other than my own organized existence. She downloaded the game on my laptop herself, created an account for me, selected a character who happened to be an archer, and then left before I could refuse. The game is called Conquest of the Iron Crown. It is a team-based strategy game in which players occupy roles in a medieval fantasy setting, and my character assigned the name Silver by Matilda, who has always had a weakness for the dramatic, was an archer with a reasonable set of initial abilities and no particular skill in the hands of someone like me who had never played a game of this kind. I was, for the first week, genuinely terrible. I read the tutorial 3 times. I watched instructional videos on the internet. I died repeatedly in ways that were, I assume, embarrassing by whatever standards the gaming community applies to these things. And then, on a Tuesday evening in April, when I had almost decided to simply uninstall the entire thing and tell Matilda I had given it a genuine effort, I received an invitation to join a team from a player whose name was listed as Rogue. I almost declined. Something stopped me. The name, perhaps? The specific quality of it, which was not the elaborate fantasy name most players seem to adopt, but something stripped and direct. The name of a person who has decided not to explain themselves. I accepted. His voice, when we connected the audio, was the first thing, not what he said. The voice itself, the specific quality of it, low and unhurried with a slight roughness, that suggested someone who did not speak more than necessary, and had therefore not worn the voice smooth. When he asked me if I understood the basics of the archer's role, I told him I had read the tutorial 3 times, and he said without any particular inflection that reading and playing were different things, and we should start. We played for 4 hours. He was extraordinary. I have since come to understand that extraordinary is an understatement, but at the time I had no frame of reference for how exceptional his skill was. He played with an economy and a precision that felt less like gaming and more like another language. The language of someone who sees patterns in complex systems before the systems have had time to reveal them. Under his guidance, I stopped dying. More than stopped dying, I began to function. I learned where to position Silver, how to read the movements of the enemy team, when to engage and when to preserve. By the end of the 4 hours, we had won 3 matches, and I had begun to understand why people found this absorbing. When we signed off, he said, "Same time Thursday." I said yes. I closed the laptop and sat in my organized apartment and thought about a voice I had heard for 4 hours and had already decided I would hear again on Thursday. This is how things begin, not dramatically, not with the event that makes you understand immediately that everything is changing, with a voice and a question and a yes. Part 2, Rogue. His name in the game was Rogue. His name in the messaging application we began using between game sessions was L because he gave me only an initial when I asked with the specific economy of someone who has decided that explanations are not for him. I called him L. He called me Cleo because I gave him my actual name, which I have always done because I find the maintenance of a pseudonym across all channels more effort than it is worth. Over the weeks that followed, L became the specific and pleasant constant of my evenings. Not every evening and not dramatically, but regularly, in the way of something that has become part of the structure of your days without you having decided to let it. Tuesday and Thursday evenings for the game, the occasional message in between something I had seen that was interesting, a problem at work that he would listen to with the same quiet economy he brought to everything, a piece of music that I thought he would find interesting. He never told me much about himself. I understood from the accumulation of small signals that he was in Paris, that he was older than me by some years, that I did not know the exact number of that his work involved the management of complex situations in ways he declined to specify. He had the specific economy of a person who has learned to give only what is necessary and to never give what is not. But he was consistent in the things he chose to give. He asked about my work with genuine interest. He remembered things I had said in previous conversations, which is the specific intelligence of someone who listens rather than waits for their turn to speak. He had opinions about the things I brought him, the book I was reading, the gallery I had attended, the problem I was working through at work, and his opinions were worth having because they came from a perspective I did not recognize from the usual directions. I began to like him in the way that you begin to like someone when you have decided without entirely deciding to make room for them, not aggressively, not with the specific intention of romance. Simply, room was made. The shape of my days adjusted slightly to accommodate a new element the way a room adjusts to a new piece of furniture that turns out to belong there. I did not know who he was. I want to be clear about this because what I felt for him was real before I knew, and the realness of it before the knowing is important. The specific quality of his attention, the voice, the economy, the consistency, these were the things I had formed a feeling about, and they were his, regardless of what else he was. What else he was, I found out on a Friday evening in May. Part 3, The Bar. Matilda called me at 8 on a Friday evening and told me she had found a new bar in the Marais that I had to see and that she was already there and that I should come immediately. I sent Elle a message telling him I had plans and would not be online that evening. He replied in the specific way he replied to everything, one word that managed to contain both acknowledgement and something warmer noted. The bar was on a side street off the Rue des Francs Bourgeois, the kind of establishment that has found the specific balance between interesting and comfortable, good wine and low ambient music and lighting that makes everyone look like they are having the evening they wanted to have. Matilda was at a corner table with a glass of something pale, and she waved when she saw me with the enthusiasm of a person who has been looking forward to this. We were an hour into the kind of conversation that good friendships are made of, the kind that moves from the practical to the personal and back again, without requiring any formal segue when 3 men came in. I noticed them the way you notice people who occupy more space than their physical size accounts for the specific quality of men who have made a practice of being certain of their welcome. They were well dressed without being precisely elegant, the clothes of money without the education that produces taste. The one in the middle was the tallest and had the specific bearing of someone around whom the others orient themselves, the gravitational center of a small group. One of the other 2 detached from the group and moved toward our table with the confidence of someone who does not anticipate rejection, because rejection has not been his experience. He said something to Matilda that I did not fully hear because I was watching the man in the center of the group who was speaking to someone on his phone with the compressed efficiency of a conversation being resolved rather than conducted. Matilda's voice sharpened beside me. I looked at her and saw that the man who had approached us was now too close, the specific spatial violation that announces bad intentions. He said something to me directly. His tone had the quality that certain men use when they have decided that the woman they are addressing is available for their attention regardless of her own assessment of the situation. I said, "We are not interested, thank you." He said something that was the next move in a specific and unpleasant game that I recognized and did not want to play, and then the quality of the room changed. The man from the center of the group was suddenly between me and the man who had been speaking in the way that certain people can cross a room without appearing to move through the intermediate space. He was very close, he was very still. He said something to the other man that I did not hear, because it was said very quietly, but the effect of it was immediate and total. The other man went back to his group, and the group left the bar within the following 2 minutes. I looked at the man standing in front of me. His face was taken feature by feature remarkable. A strong jaw, dark eyes, with the specific quality of someone who is always assessing a scar on the left side of his chin that was faint enough to be missed and visible enough to be noted. He was perhaps 35. He was wearing a dark jacket over a shirt that was open at the collar, and his hands, when he turned to look at me, were the hands of someone who has used them in ways that leave marks. He said, "Are you all right?" The voice. I knew the voice. I stood in the bar on the Rue des Francs Bourgeois with my heartbeat doing something irregular, and I looked at the man who had just made 3 other men leave the room with 7 words, and I heard his voice and I knew. L. Part 4, who he was. His name was Laurent Voss. Matilda told me afterward in the taxi going home with the specific compressed urgency of someone delivering information they cannot believe they have. She told me the way people tell things that are simultaneously impossible and documented fact. Laurent Voss was, she said, one of the 3 men who controlled the organized crime network in Paris. Not the largest of its kind in France, but the most efficiently run, the most strategically positioned, and the most difficult to touch through official channels, not because of any particular corruption of those channels, but because Laurent Voss was, by every account, too intelligent and too careful to provide those channels with what they needed. He was not a man who appeared in newspapers. He was not a man who appeared at the kind of events where being seen was part of the function of being. He was a man who moved, Matilda said, like a shadow, which was partly hyperbole and partly the specific observation of someone who had just watched him cross a room and resolve a situation in under 30 seconds without raising his voice. He had come into that position through a sequence of events that Matilda knew partly through her cousin, who worked in something adjacent to the legal system, and partly through the specific gossip of a certain stratum of Parisian society that knows things because it has the proximity to know them. He had come from nothing, had built something, had protected what he built with the ruthless precision of someone who understands that what you build without protection does not remain yours for long. He was also, I sat with this in the taxi while the arrondissements went past the window, the man I had been talking to for 6 weeks. The man whose voice I had heard for hours across gaming sessions, and whose messages I had looked forward to with a feeling I had not fully named, but that had been present nonetheless. The man who called me Cleo and listened when I talked about the gallery on Sunday, and remembered that I preferred white wine to red, and had asked once in the way of someone who wants to know and has decided that wanting to know is sufficient reason to ask what my apartment looked like. I went home and sat in the apartment and did not message him. He messaged me at 11. 3 words I should explain. I sat with my phone and I thought about 3 words and a voice and the way he had stood in front of me in the bar without the performance that other people deploy in that kind of moment, simply there, simply present. I wrote back, "Yes, you should." He wrote, "When?" I wrote, "Tomorrow." Part 5, the explanation. He came to a cafe on the Ile Saint-Louis. I chose it because it was mine, a place I had been going to since I was a student, where the owner knew my order and the back table by the window was almost always available, because it faced a courtyard rather than the street, and people prefer to see the street. He was there before me. He had the specific quality of someone who is always early, because lateness is a form of exposure that he has trained himself not to produce. He stood when I came in, which was a gesture I had not expected from him, and that registered as information. We sat. The owner brought my coffee without being asked, which I saw him notice. He said, "I knew who you were before you knew who I was." I said, "Explain that." He said, 2 months before we met in the game, you were referred to me professionally. A situation involving your firm. A counterparty with connections to a network I manage. The matter was resolved without your involvement or your knowledge. But I had seen your name. I said, "You sought me out in the game." He said, "No, I did not know you played. The invitation was genuine. I said, but you recognized my name. He said, yes. I looked at my coffee. He said, I understand if this changes things. I said, I do not know yet whether it changes things. First, I need to understand what things I am dealing with. He looked at me across the table with the specific quality of attention that I had heard in his voice for weeks. The complete kind, the kind that is not waiting for its turn but is actually receiving what is being offered. He said, what do you want to know? I said, everything that is relevant. He told me, not everything he told me later, that everything was not his to tell, and that some of what he did was not for me to carry. But what was relevant, the shape of his life, the structure of what he managed, the specific nature of the power he held, and the costs it exacted and the lines he had chosen to draw within it, he told me. He did it with the same economy he brought to everything. But the economy was not evasion, it was precision. He gave me what I needed to understand, and not what would have overwhelmed without adding to the understanding. When he finished, I sat with it for a while. I said, you could have not told me any of this. He said, yes. I said, why did you tell me? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, because I have been doing this for a long time, and I have not had a conversation like this, the ones we have been having, in a very long time. And I am old enough to understand that conversations like this are not common and should not be managed away. I said, you could have met me under false pretenses, maintained the online version. He said, I could have. I said, but. He said, but I do not want a version of you that is based on a lie. I have enough of that in the rest of my life. We sat in the cafe on the Ile Saint Louis. The courtyard outside the back window was doing the May thing, beginning to go green, the specific green of Paris in May, that comes suddenly and completely as though the city has remembered an obligation. I said, I need time. He said, I know. I said, I am not saying no. He said, I heard you. He paid for the coffee and left. I sat for a while after looking at the courtyard. I was not afraid of him. This is what I told myself in the weeks that followed, and it was true. But it was not the complete truth. The complete truth was that I was afraid of something more specific and more interior than him. I was afraid of the version of me that had already decided, regardless of all the excellent reasons not to, that the conversations were worth the complication. I sent him a message at 11 that night. It said next Thursday, game night. He replied in 4 seconds noted. Part 6, the family. This is where the story changes, or where the shape of it becomes larger than two people in a cafe and a game and a voice. My father called me on the Saturday after the cafe meeting. He called at 9 in the morning, which was unusual enough to make me understand immediately that something had happened. My father is a man of routines, and his Saturday routine does not include phone calls before 10. He told me that my brother Olivier was in trouble, not the kind of trouble that requires a phone call at 9 on a Saturday morning, the kind that requires it. Olivier is 32. He has always been the one in our family who approached the world with a specific combination of optimism and poor judgment that produced over the years a sequence of situations that required the rest of us to provide varying degrees of assistance. He had started a business 2 years earlier, a small events management company, which had done reasonably well until it had not done well, and in the period of not doing well, he had made a specific and disastrous decision to borrow money from people who were not the kind of people who offered formal terms. The people he had borrowed from were connected to a man named Marcus Bauer. My father said this name as though I might know it. I did not then. I understood later. I went to my parents' house in Vincennes that afternoon. My mother was in the kitchen in the way she goes to the kitchen when things are difficult, making food with the focused attention of someone performing a practical action against the impossibility of the impractical situation. My father was in the study. Olivier was on the sofa with the specific quality of someone who has run out of his own resources and is now waiting to see if anyone else has any. He told me the amount. I breathed through the amount. He told me what would happen if the amount was not resolved by the end of the month. He had been told this clearly and in the specific language of people who mean what they say. I sat with my family in the house in Vincennes, and I looked at my brother on the sofa and I thought, I know someone. The specific nature of knowing someone in this context was not straightforward. I had been in communication with Lauren Voss for 9 weeks. I had met him once in a cafe. I had not seen him since, and we had returned to the online dynamic game nights and messages, as though the cafe meeting had been a parenthesis that we had agreed to close without resolving. I did not know what I was to him or what he was to me. I knew only the voice and the conversations and the way he had stood in front of me in the bar on the Rue des Francs Bourgeois. I went home. I sat in my apartment for 2 hours. Then I called him. He answered on the second ring. I said, I need to tell you something and ask you something, and I need you to tell me honestly if either of them is something you cannot do. He said, tell me. I told him about Olivier, about Marcus Bauer, about the amount and the timeline. When I finished, there was a silence that was not the silence of someone who has nothing to say, but the silence of someone who is doing rapid and expert calculation. He said, how did your brother come to be borrowing from Bauer? I said, through a contact he trusted who was not reliable. He said, what does your brother know about Bauer? I said, almost nothing. He thought he was borrowing from a private investor. Another silence. He said, Cleo, are you asking me to intervene in this? I said, I am asking you if you can. And whether the asking changes things between us in a way I should know about before I ask. He was quiet for a long moment. He said, it does not change things between us. It changes things with Bauer, which is a separate matter and one I can manage, but I need you to understand something. I said, tell me. He said, helping your brother means entering your family's life. It means the situation between you and me becomes something that your family is connected to. I want you to understand that before you ask me to do it, because once I do it, the connection exists and it is not something that can be made not to exist. I sat with this. He said, take time. I said, I do not have very much time. He said, I know, but take what you have. I took 2 hours. Then I called him back. I said, yes. He said, all right. He said it in the specific way he said things when he had already decided and was now implementing the word, carrying the weight of something already in motion. He said, keep your brother in Vincennes for the next week. Tell him not to contact Bauer directly. Tell your parents the same. I said, what are you going to do? He said, resolve it. I said, how? He said, I will tell you after. It is better for you not to know the process. I said, I need to know enough to make the decision. He said, the decision is made. The rest is mine. There was something in this that I found both difficult and correct. The difficulty was the not knowing. The correctness was that he understood I was not the kind of person who would rest more easily, knowing details she could not do anything with. He was managing the partition thoughtfully. I said, thank you. He said, do not thank me yet. Part 7, the resolution. He resolved it in 4 days. I know this because on the 4th day, Olivier called me to say that the people he had been frightened of had contacted him and told him the debt had been purchased and cleared, and that he owed nothing. My brother, who is optimistic and has poor judgment, was so relieved that he did not ask the obvious question, which was how this had happened. I had told him only that I was working on it and that he should wait. He had waited, and the waiting had been rewarded. And in the relief of the reward, he did not press for the explanation. My parents were different. My mother accepted the outcome with the practical gratitude of a woman who has learned over decades that there are situations where the best response is to receive the gift and not require a complete accounting of the mechanism. My father was more careful. He asked me once quietly in the kitchen while my mother was elsewhere, "Who did you go to?" "Go," I said, "someone I trust." He looked at me for a moment with the specific attention of a man who has spent 40 years reading situations accurately. He said, "Is this someone I am going to be meeting?" I said, "I do not know yet." He said, "I would like to meet him." I said, "I know." He went back to the sitting room and I stood in the kitchen for a while thinking about what my father had understood from very little information, and what that said about the quality of his attention and how it reminded me of someone. Laurent called me that evening. He said, "It is done." I said, "I know." Olivier called me. He said, "How is he?" I said, "Relieved," and not asking questions. He said, "That is the best outcome." I said, yes, Laurent. He said, yes. I said, thank you. A pause. Then you are welcome. I said, I need to ask you something else. He said, ask. I said, what exactly did you do? I'm not asking for the mechanism. I am asking whether anyone was hurt. The pause this time was longer. He said no one was hurt. The debt was acquired through a financial instrument that Bauer's network routinely uses. I used it first. The debt transferred to me and I cleared it. Bauer knows not to pursue your brother. He will not. I said he knows not to because, he said, because I have explained the value I place on the matter which makes any contrary action prohibitively expensive for him. I said you threatened him. He said I communicated clearly. There is a distinction. I considered this. I said, Laurent, I need to meet you. He said when. I said now. Part 8, the third person. There is a woman named Isabelle Renard. She is 32. She moves in the circles that Laurent's professional life requires him to be adjacent to the people who have money derived from complicated sources and who require certain services that the conventional world does not offer. She is beautiful in the specific constructed way of someone who understands beauty as a professional tool and has invested accordingly. She has known Laurent for 5 years. I found out about her not from Laurent and not from Mathilde, and not from the specific gossip network that Mathilde sometimes accesses. I found out from Arnaud, who works for Laurent, and who told me in the specific conflicted way of someone who believes he is doing the right thing and is not entirely certain. Arnaud is loyal to Laurent in the way that a good person is loyal to someone they work for, which means the loyalty has limits that are defined by his own sense of what is right. He came to me 3 weeks after the Olivier situation at the cafe on the Ile Saint-Louis, that I had apparently become known as my place, and he sat across from me and said, there is something you should know. Isabelle Renard was not Laurent's girlfriend. She was not his ex-girlfriend. She was something more complicated and more difficult, a person who had been over 5 years the specific kind of presence that powerful men sometimes maintain alongside their actual lives, someone who understood the world he operated in, who required nothing that he could not provide, who made no claims on the interior life. She had been told, Arnaud said that I existed. Laurent had told her himself, apparently, in the specific direct way he did things. He had told her that the arrangement was ending because something had changed, and she had accepted this with the controlled grace of someone who had always understood the arrangement might end. But she had not entirely accepted it. Arnaud said she has been making certain inquiries about you, about your family. I sat with this. I said, what kind of inquiries? He said the kind that a person makes when they want to understand where a threat is coming from. I said, does she have connections that would allow her to act on what she learns? He said, yes, she does. I said, does Laurent know she is doing this? Arnaud looked at the table. I said, he does not know. He said, I did not want to go to him without first speaking to you. This is your situation as much as his. I looked at Arnaud, who had the face of a man who is loyal and is currently doing something difficult because he believes it is right. I said, thank you for telling me. He said, what are you going to do? I said, I am going to tell Laurent. He said, that will cause a problem between them. I said, yes, that is the correct outcome. He looked at me for a moment. He said, you are not what I expected. I said, what did you expect? He said, someone who needed protecting. I said, everyone needs protecting sometimes. That is not the same as needing it always. I went home and called Laurent. Part 9, the confrontation. He listened to what I told him without interrupting. When I finished, he said, how long have you known? I said 40 minutes. He said, who told you? I said, someone who thought you should know and came to me first because they wanted to give me the choice. He was quiet. I could hear in the quality of the quiet the specific internal process of a man who is rearranging his understanding of a situation he had believed he had managed. He said, I will handle this. I said, Laurent. He said, yes. I said, I need you to listen to me for a moment before you handle anything. A pause. He said, I am listening. I said, the way you handle this matters, not the outcome. The outcome is clear. The way. I need you to handle it in a way that does not involve anything that I would have to pretend I did not know about afterward. Another pause longer. He said, you are drawing a line. I said, I am telling you where I stand. He said, even now. I said, especially now. If you and I are going to be anything real, the lines have to be there from the beginning. You told me in the cafe that you did not want a version of me based on a lie. I am telling you I do not want a version of us based on me looking away from things I should not look away from. The silence this time was the kind that contained something being decided. He said, all right. I said, all right, what? He said, all right, I will handle it the way you are describing. It will not be the most efficient resolution, but it will be clean. I said, thank you. He said, Cleo. I said, yes. He said, you are not afraid of me. I said, no. He said, most people are. I said, I know, I am not most people. He said, no, you are not. He resolved the Isabel situation in the way he had said he would, which I did not need to know the details of, and chose not to ask about. Because there are things that belong to the execution of a decision, rather than to the decision itself, and I have learned to understand the distinction. What I knew was this: she stopped making inquiries. She moved to another city, which may or may not have been connected, and which I did not investigate. The specific category of threat she had represented resolved. Laurent called me afterward. He said, it is done. I said, how? He said, a conversation. Clear terms. She is a practical person when the terms are clear. I said, did you threaten her? He said, I communicated clearly. I said, you are going to keep using that phrase. He said, it is accurate. I said, Laurent. He said, yes. I said, I need you to come here. He said, where is here? I said, my apartment. I will send you the address. He said, I know the address. I said, of course you do. He said, is that a problem? I said, no, come at 7. He came at 7. Part 10, the apartment. He stood in the doorway of my apartment and looked at it the way he looked at everything, with the complete attention of someone for whom looking is a form of work. And also something else, something that does not have a professional name. He said, this is what I thought it would look like. I said, what did you think it would look like? He said, organized. A few things that are there because they matter rather than because they fill space. Good books. A view that you chose for reasons other than the obvious ones. I looked at my apartment through this description. I said, come in. He came in. I had made dinner, which was a decision I had made in the morning, and had not overthought, because overthinking it would have required me to make the making of dinner into something more than it was, which was simply the right thing to do when someone was coming to your apartment. We sat at the table. The dinner was good, not elaborate, the specific quality of food made by someone who knows what they are doing and was not trying to demonstrate anything by it. He ate with the same economy he brought to everything, the economy of someone who does not overdo any gesture. And he asked me about the book I was currently reading, a question that was the right question. We talked the way we had been talking for months, the way that had become the specific, familiar quality of our conversations, moving through things without forcing them, finding the connections between subjects rather than manufacturing transitions. After dinner, I poured wine and we moved to the sitting room. He sat in the chair by the window, which is the chair I sit in when I am reading alone, and the specific rightness of him in it was a piece of information I accepted without examining too closely. He said, I need to tell you something. I said, tell me. He said, what happened with your brother, the intervention, the situation with Isabel afterward. These things are going to happen again, not those exact things, but things of that nature. The world I operate in creates situations, and situations have consequences, and the consequences do not always stay inside the world where the situations were generated. I said, I know. He said, you cannot fully know, not yet. I said, you are warning me. He said, yes. I said, and you are warning me because he looked at me with the quality I knew now as his real attentiveness, the kind that is not assessment but actual seeing. He said, because I am not willing to pretend. This is simpler than it is in order to keep you. And because you are the kind of person who would eventually see through any simplification I offered, and I would prefer that the seeing through happened now rather than later. I said, that is a very long way of saying you want me to choose with full information. He said, yes. I said, and if I choose not to proceed? He said, then that is the choice, and it is a reasonable choice. I looked at him in the chair by the window in my organized apartment with the books, and the view I had chosen for the right reasons. I said, Laurent, I have been choosing for the past 3 months. Every time I messaged you, every game night, the cafe, the call about Olivier. These were all choices. He said, I know. I said, so I do not need to choose again. The choice is already made. What I need from you is the same thing I told you on the phone. No lying, no managing me, no decisions about what I am capable of handling that are made without consulting me. He was quiet. I said, I will not pretend your world is something I am already comfortable in. I am not. But I am capable of learning things and making decisions based on what I learn. I need you to trust that. He said, I do. I said, then we are fine. He looked at me for a long time. He said, you are remarkable. I said, no, I am just specific about what I need. He said, that is the same thing. Part 11, the game. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday evening, we played the game. Not separately, not from different locations with headsets in different apartments. Together at the desk in my apartment, which we had spent the previous Saturday rearranging slightly to accommodate 2 chairs and 2 screens. Because he owned a laptop that he had brought and I owned the desktop, and the specific ergonomics of the previous arrangement had been designed for one person. His character in the game is still called Rogue. Mine is still called Silver. The team we play in is the same team we have been part of for months, and the other players on the team do not know anything about us, beyond the game, which is the way we both prefer it. He plays with the same economy he brings to everything. The movements are efficient and the decisions are rapid, and he has the specific quality of someone who can hold a large number of variables in mind simultaneously and prioritize them correctly without visible effort. Watching him from beside him is a different experience from hearing him through a headset. The concentration is visible. The quality of his attention directed at the screen is the same quality he directs at everything complete. At one point in the match, I was in a position that should have been safe and was not because the enemy team had anticipated correctly where Silver would position herself and had arranged for a specific sequence of events that was going to end badly. And Rogue appeared from the opposite direction from where I expected him, from the less obvious approach, and cleared the space with 3 moves that were so precisely calculated that they looked to anyone watching like luck. He said into the headset, stop moving for 3 seconds. I stopped. He resolved the situation. The 3 seconds became our survival. He said, now go. I went. We won. We almost always win. The team performs in the upper tier of the ranked ladder, and our contribution to that performance is real mine, genuinely grown now from the first fumbling weeks. He's constant in the way that his consistency in everything is constant. After the game, when the other players had logged off and we were still connected and the game was quiet on both screens, he said, you did not hesitate. I said, when? He said, when I told you to stop. You stopped immediately. I said, you told me to stop. He said, you trusted me. I said, yes. He said, in the game. I said, in the game and outside it. The game is just the version where the consequences are lower. He turned and looked at me. The screen light was the only light in the room. His face, in the specific quality of that light, was the face I had been hearing for months before I saw it. And the seeing of it was still after everything something I did not have a word for. He said, Cleo. I said, yes. He said, I need to tell you something I have not told you. I said, tell me. He said, the situation I am in the world I manage it is not forever. I have been working toward a point for 3 years at which the level of exposure I carry would be significantly reduced. I am not in a position to tell you exactly what that looks like or when it arrives, but it is what I am working toward. I looked at him. I said, you are planning an exit. He said, I am planning a reduction, a fundamental change in the nature of what I do. Whether it constitutes an exit depends on definitions. I said, why are you telling me this now? He said, because you said no, managing you without consultation. And this is relevant. I said, when? He said, 2 years, perhaps 3. I said, and in the meantime. He said, in the meantime, exactly as it is now, which is imperfect and complicated and real. I sat in my apartment at the game desk with the screen light between us. I said I can do imperfect and complicated and real. He said, I know. That is one of the things about you. I said, what are the other things? He listed them. Not dramatically, not as a performance, in the specific economy of someone saying what is true because it is true. The list was accurate and specific and contained things I had not known he had noticed, and the noticing of them was in the way of things that matter more than they appear to the most important part. When he finished, I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, Laurent. He said, yes. I said, come away from the desk. He came away from the desk. Part 12, What My Family Understood. My father met Laurent on a Sunday in July. This had been Mathilde's suggestion, which I relayed to Laurent, who considered it with the specific deliberateness he applies to things he is uncertain about, and then said yes, which is what he says when he has decided and does not want to make the deciding more visible than it needs to be. We went to my parents' house in Vincennes for Sunday lunch. My mother made the specific Sunday lunch of my childhood, the roast, with the vegetables arranged in the way she has always arranged them, and the bread from the boulangerie 2 streets away, and the wine my father keeps for occasions. Olivier was there, which I had not expected, but should have. He had the specific uncomfortable quality of someone who knows that the person who resolved his most urgent problem is in the room and who is not sure how to exist in the presence of that knowledge. He managed it by being overly cheerful, which is Olivier's management strategy for most situations. Laurent managed the table in the way he manages everything, with a specific economy and intelligence that does not announce itself. He asked my father the right questions about his work and listened with genuine interest to the answers. He talked to my mother about the garden with the specific attention of someone who has been in enough well-tended gardens to understand what they require. He said very little about himself and nothing at all about his professional life. After lunch, when my mother and Olivier had gone to the kitchen, my father and Laurent sat in the garden with their coffee and I watched from the kitchen window through the glass. I could not hear what they said. I saw my father speak and Laurent listen. I saw Laurent speak and my father listen. I saw my father ask something that required Laurent to pause before answering. I saw Laurent answer and my father sit back in his chair with the specific quality of someone who has received information and is arranging it. When I came out with the coffee pot to refill their cups, my father looked up at me with the expression he has when he has decided something. He said, sit down, Cleo. I sat. He said to both of us, I am not going to pretend I understand your life, Laurent. I am also not going to pretend I did not look into who you are in the weeks since Cleo told me she was seeing you. I am an old man, and I know what I know, and I will tell you what I know, and then you can tell me what you think. Lauren said, please. My father said, you are dangerous. You operate in a world that has rules I do not understand, and methods I would not choose. You have also twice now intervened in this family situation in ways that cost you something and asked for nothing in return. And you are sitting in my garden on a Sunday afternoon, which tells me something about what you think matters. Lauren said nothing. My father said what I want to know is one thing only. My daughter is specific about what she values, and she does not spend time on things that do not earn that specificity. So my question is, do you understand what she has given you by choosing this? And do you understand what it cost her to trust it? Laurent looked at my father for a long moment. He said, yes. My father said that is the right answer. Whether it is the true answer, I will find out over time. Laurent said, that is a fair arrangement. My father said it is the only arrangement I am offering. They drank their coffee. I sat between them in the garden in Vincennes in the July afternoon light, and I thought about my father being 68 years old and having the specific intelligence to ask the only question that mattered. Later, walking to the car, Laurent said, your father is remarkable. I said, he is. He has always been the person in our family who sees things clearly. He said, I know where you get it from. I said, he is better at it than I am. He said, give it 30 years. I looked at him. He said, that is assuming. I said, yes, it is. He said good. We drove back to Paris in the Sunday evening light. The city was doing the thing it does in July when the heat of the day has passed, and the buildings hold the warmth, and the streets are full of people who have nowhere specific to be, which is one of the things about Paris that I have always found specifically beautiful. He reached over and took my hand on the gear shift. His hand was larger than mine, and the specific weight of it was something I had not had time to get used to, and was not trying to get used to quickly, because some things are better if you pay attention to them, rather than absorbing them into the category of the expected. I looked out the window at Paris in July. I thought about a voice in a game and a bar on the Rue des Francs Bourgeois, and a cafe on the Ile Saint-Louis, and my brother on the sofa in Vincennes, and a woman named Isabelle Renard, who had been handled cleanly, and a game desk in my apartment with 2 chairs and a father in a garden, asking the only question that mattered. I thought about imperfect and complicated and real. The city went past the window. His hand on the gear shift. This was the beginning of something that was going to require both of us to be more than we had been. We were both going to try. Epilogue, the game. A year later. It is a Tuesday evening. The desk in my apartment has been replaced by a larger desk. Because when 2 people share a space, they either make it work or they don't, and we made it work, which required certain adjustments to the space that were made over several weekends, with the specific, productive argument of 2 people who have strong opinions about spatial arrangements and who have learned to negotiate these opinions honestly. Laurent is beside me, Rogue and Silver. The team is the same, the other players, still knowing nothing about us beyond the game, which is still the way we both prefer it. The match is in progress. The enemy team has made a decision that is clearly strategic, positioning their players for a specific sequence that will, if executed, be effective. Laurent sees it. I know he sees it from the specific quality of his attention, which changes when he has identified something. He says quietly, left flank. 30 seconds. I position Silver on the left flank. I wait. 28 seconds later, the sequence begins on the left flank, and Silver is exactly where she needs to be, and Rogue appears from the angle the enemy team did not anticipate. And together we dismantle what they spent the last 10 minutes constructing. He says, there. I say, I see it. We win. After the match, after the other players have logged off, I lean back in my chair and look at the ceiling. I say, Laurent. He says, yes. I say, you knew I would be there. He says, I knew you would understand the signal. I say, you trusted me. He says, yes. I say, in the game. He says, and his voice has the specific quality of something that is not entirely about the game and outside it. I look at the ceiling of my apartment. Outside, Paris is doing what Paris does in June, the long light that reaches past 9 in the evening and makes the city look like it is performing something that was made for this specific quality of illumination. The books are on the shelves. The table has 2 places set. The desk has 2 chairs. He reaches over and closes my hand in his. I say, good. He says, good. The game screen dims to its resting state. Outside, the June light does what it does. We are here. That is all. That is everything. And my online boyfriend is the most dangerous man in the city is an original dramatic narrative set in Paris, France. All characters, events, and institutions depicted herein are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to actual organizations or events is entirely coincidental. Additional chapter Mathilde. I want to tell you about Mathilda because she is the one who started all of this, and she deserves to know what she started. Mathilda Bonnet is my oldest friend. We met at university in the 3rd week of our first year at a lecture on financial instruments that we were both attending reluctantly. She turned to me during the lecture and said that the person presenting was wrong about a specific formula, and she would appreciate it if I would agree or disagree, because she needed to know if she was going crazy. I disagreed and told her she was right, and we have been friends ever since, which is now 9 years. Mathilda is the opposite of me in most visible respects. She is extroverted, where I am precise. She makes decisions quickly where I make them thoroughly. She has a social life that I participate in occasionally and admire from a greater distance. She has dated in our 9 years of friendship more men than I can number, most of them interesting for specific reasons, and most of those reasons having nothing to do with long-term compatibility. She is 30 years old and she is having an excellent time, and I genuinely believe this is the right choice for her. She called me 2 weeks after the Sunday lunch in Vincennes. She said, "Tell me everything." I told her most of it. Not the Isabel situation, because that belonged to Laurent and to me and not to the general circulation, but the game and the bar and the cafe and Olivier and the Sunday lunch. She listened with the specific quality she has for receiving information, which is less patient than my quality, but more enthusiastic. The listening of someone who is genuinely interested and occasionally unable to prevent their interest from becoming audible. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I downloaded that game for you because you needed a controlled stimulus." I said, "Yes." She said, "I do not think this was what I had in mind." I said, "No." She said, "But." I said, "But what?" She said, "Is he good to you?" I said, "Yes, in the specific way that matters." She said, "Which is?" I said, "He tells me the truth. He gives me what I ask for and does not pretend the rest does not exist. He sees me." Matilda was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "That is the whole of it, isn't it? The seeing." I said, "Yes, that is the whole of it." She said, "I want to meet him." I said, "I know." She said, "When?" I said, "Soon." She said, "Cleo." I said, "Yes." She said, "You sound different." I said, "Different how?" She said, "Like someone who has found the place they were going to. Not arrived exactly, but found it." I said, "That is a strange way to put it." She said, "It is accurate." I sat with this. She said, "I am glad. The game thing was an accident, and this was an accident, and you are terrible at accidents, but this one was the right kind." I said, "Thank you, Matilda." She said, "Do not thank me. Buy me a very good dinner when you introduce me to him." I did. Laurent chose the restaurant, which he does with the same quality he brings to everything, the specific understanding of what a space needs to be for the people who will be in it. He chose somewhere that was interesting without being trying. Matilda sat across from him for 3 hours, and when we left, she said, "I see it." I said, "What do you see?" She said, "The thing you described." "The seeing." I said, "Yes." She said, "He watches you the way you watch things you find genuinely interesting, not to analyze, just because you want to." I said, "Yes." She said, "Good. He is completely terrifying, but he watches you like that, and so he is also fine." I said, "Thank you for your assessment." She said, "You are welcome. The dinner was excellent." Additional chapter, what I learned about the world. I want to be honest about what it is to be adjacent to the world Laurent operates in, because the honest version matters, and the dishonest version, the version that smooths over the edges, would not be the story I actually lived. There are evenings when he is not reachable, not often and never without a message that tells me he is unavailable, but the quality of those evenings is specific and requires managing. Not fear exactly, something more like the specific awareness of a person who understands that the person they love is in a situation that has risks she cannot evaluate from where she is standing, and who has decided that this awareness is the cost of honesty and pays it accordingly. There are things I do not ask about. I made this decision consciously, and I want to be clear that it was a decision rather than a default. The difference between choosing not to look and not being shown. The line I drew was this: anything that affects my safety or the safety of my family, I need to know. Anything else I do not need to know. Laurent understood this distinction immediately and has operated within it without apparent difficulty, because the distinction makes sense to someone who is accustomed to managing information. There was a night in October when I understood the weight of it more completely than I had before. He came to the apartment later than expected, and he was very still in the way of someone who has been managing something difficult for several hours, and whose capacity for managing is not infinite. He did not tell me what had happened. He sat in the chair by the window and I made tea and sat on the floor beside the chair and we were quiet for a long time. After a while he said, "There are things I wish I could change about the work I do." I said, "I know, Isa, I know." He said, "Not that I would change the outcome. The outcome was necessary. But the way things have to be done sometimes." I said, "I know." He said, "You cannot actually know." I said, "No, but I can be here while you carry what you cannot tell me." He looked down at me from the chair. His face in the October evening had the specific quality it has when the management is not quite holding, when the thing underneath is briefly visible. He said, "That is enough. Being here is enough." I said, "Good, because it is what I have." He reached down and put his hand on my hair in the specific way of someone who does not make this kind of gesture often and means it completely when they do. We stayed like that for a while. This is the thing I want to say about the honest version. The wait is real, and it is sometimes considerable, but the person carrying it with you is the same person who chooses the right restaurant and asks the right question about the book you are reading and positions himself on the left flank 30 seconds before you need him there. These are not separate people, they are the same person. And choosing to be with that person means receiving all of him, which is what I said I would do and what I mean. Imperfect and complicated and real. Yes, all three, worth it. Additional chapter, a Tuesday in December. The specific one I want to tell you about is a Tuesday in December. 14 months after the first game night. It was raining, not the pleasant Paris rain that makes the streets look like reflections of themselves, but the specific December rain that comes in sideways and means business. I was at my desk at work and the afternoon had the quality of the specific December afternoon of a financial analyst in the fourth quarter, which is to say intense and demanding and not entirely unpleasant, because the intensity is the kind that produces results. At 4 in the afternoon, I received a message from Laurent. It said, "Can you leave early?" I looked at the message for a moment. Laurent does not ask me to leave work early. He is, if anything, more respectful of my work time than I am, understanding that the work is mine and that what is mine deserves protection. I said, "What is happening?" He said, "Nothing is happening. I want to show you something before it gets dark." I looked at the December rain outside the office window. I said, "It is already dark." He said, "Darker then. Can you leave?" I left. I met him in the car outside the building where he was standing in the rain without an umbrella, which is a thing he does because he does not like umbrellas and refuses to carry them regardless of the weather. His coat was wet across the shoulders. I said, "You are soaked." He said, "I know. Get in, huh? Get in." He drove south out of the 4th arrondissement and across the river and through the 14th to a street I did not know and stopped in front of a building that had a for sale sign in the window and lights on inside that suggested someone had left them on by mistake or had been there recently. I said, "What is this?" He said, "Come and look." The building was a narrow 4-story structure on a street that was close enough to the Luxembourg Gardens to matter but far enough away to be affordable by the specific calculations of a city like Paris. The ground floor had been at some point a commercial space. Above it were 3 floors of apartments, or what had been apartments, now in the process of a renovation that had stopped partway through for reasons I did not know. He had a key. He unlocked the front door, and I followed him inside. The space was cold and smelled of plaster and the specific mineral smell of construction that has paused. But the bones of it were good. The ceilings were high. The windows on the front were the tall French windows of a certain era proportioned correctly. The staircase was original. I walked through the ground floor and up the stairs and through what had been the first floor apartment, and stood at the tall front window looking at the street in the December rain. I said, "Laurent." He said, "Yes." I said, "What are you showing me?" He said, "What I have been working toward for 3 years." I turned from the window. He said, "The business I have been building for the past 3 years. The parallel structure, the legitimate one. It is at the point where it can sustain itself and where the other things can be reduced. This building is part of it. I am acquiring it through the legitimate structure and converting it. The ground floor will be commercial rental. The upper floors will be residential. It will not be glamorous. It will be correct. I looked at him in the half-light of a building under renovation in the December rain. I said, "You are showing me the exit." He said, "I am showing you the door of the exit. The exit itself will take time, but I wanted you to see that the door exists." I looked at the staircase, the windows, the ceiling height. I said, "It has good bones." He said, "Yes." I said, "The staircase is original." He said, "I know." I said, "The windows are right." He said, "Yes." I walked back to where he was standing. He was very still in the way he is when something matters enough to require the stillness. I said, "Laurent." He said, "Yes." I said, "Thank you for showing me." He said, "I needed you to see it." I said, "I know." We stood in the building on the street near the Luxembourg Gardens in the December rain, and the light someone had left on lit the dust in the air. And outside the tall windows, the city was doing what the city does in December, continuing with its particular and specific beauty regardless of the rain. He reached over and took my hand. I said, "Good bones." He said, "Yes." I said, "We can work with good bones." He said, "Yes." The rain on the windows, the dust in the light, his hand. "Yes." Additional chapter Olivier. I want to tell you what happened to Olivier because he is not a character in this story who deserves to disappear after being the problem that needed solving. In the months after the resolution of his debt situation, my brother did what he does, which is to recover his optimism rapidly and to find in the near disaster a lesson that he applies going forward with the mixed results that characterize his application of most lessons. He closed the events management company which had been the source of the problem and spent 3 months reconsidering what he actually wanted to do with his working life, which is the first time he had reconsidered this with any genuine rigor. He has always had, underneath the poor judgment and the excess optimism, a talent for making people feel comfortable and well hosted. This is not a small talent. It is in the correct application a significant one. He found the correct application in the management of a small boutique hotel in the 6th arrondissement, where the owner was an older man who had been running the hotel for 30 years and wanted someone who could take on the day-to-day with the right quality of attention and care. Olivier applied on the recommendation of a contact started and has been there since, and he is, by the specific evidence of the hotel's consistent occupancy and the quality of the reviews it receives, genuinely good at it. He met Laurent properly for the first time at the Sunday lunch in Vincennes, and the meeting was characterized by the specific and slightly painful quality of a man encountering the person who had resolved his most embarrassing crisis. Olivier managed this by being too cheerful, and Laurent managed it by being courteous and asking him about his work, which was the right question, because Olivier's new work was something he was genuinely proud of, and the opportunity to speak about it with someone who listened was sufficient to relax what had been a considerable tension. By the end of lunch, they were discussing with apparent genuine interest on both sides the specific challenges of managing customer expectations in the hospitality sector, which is a conversation that would not have seemed likely when I first knew either of them. My brother said to me afterward when we were in the kitchen and Laurent was in the garden with my father, "He is not what I expected." I said, "What did you expect?" He said, "Something more dramatic. He is very quiet." I said, "Yes?" He said, "He watches you." I said, "I know." He said, "Not in a possessive way, in the way of someone who is paying attention." I said, "Yes." Olivier looked at me with the specific expression of my brother when he has understood something and is deciding whether to say it. He said, "Cleo, I know what he did for me. I know it was not simple, and I know it was because of you. I have not said this directly, and I should have said it before now. Thank you." I said, "You do not need to thank me." He said, "Yes, I do. And I should thank him, which I am going to do today, even if it is awkward." He went into the garden. I watched through the kitchen window as he walked to where Laurent and my father were sitting and said something that required Laurent to look at him for a moment and then nod once, which is what Laurent does when something has been received and does not require further comment. Olivier came back in looking slightly less uncomfortable than before. He said it was not a matter for thanks. I said, that sounds right. He said he also said that if I had questions about the hospitality sector and financing, I could call him. I said, that also sounds right. He said he knows about hotel financing. I said he knows about many things. Olivier looked at me. He said, you are happy, Cleo? I said, yes. He said, good, that is the thing. He went back to the table to help my mother with the dessert. I stood in the kitchen of my parents' house and looked through the window at the garden and my father and Laurence sitting in the July light with their coffee. And I thought about a voice in a game and a bar and a cafe and a building with good bones in the December rain. That is the thing. Yes.